So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for signing up for this event, Understanding and Automating Counterspeech. First of all, introduce all the speakers of our first session. So we have Amalia Álvarez, we have Sina Laubenstein, and Erin Saltman. Amalia, first of all, is a senior research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Research on Collective Goods in Bonn, Germany. And there she's part of the research group Mechanisms for Normative Change. Her general research interests focus on conditions under which social norms change and emerge. More specifically, she has been looking at the role of social norms in the fight against online hate speech, how anti-prejudice norms are affected by sudden events, or how populist political rhetoric can undermine these norms. In her research, Amalia makes use of a variety of different experimental and quasi-experimental methods, such as original lab in the field online experiments. And her most recent publications include topics such as the breakdown of anti-racist norms, a natural experiment on hate speech after terrorist attacks, as well as normative change and culture of hate, an experiment in online environments. That is Amalia. I'm going to just introduce everyone in the first round. So then we have Sina Laubenstein. Sina is a political scientist and an expert and consultant on digital violence and civic engagement online. She has been working at the Neue Deutsche Medienmacherin since 2016. There she heads the project Die Würde des Menschen ist unhassbar, or in English, Human Dignity is Unhateable, No Hate Speech, which among other things is responsible for the Council of Europe initiative No Hate Speech movement in Germany. She's also working with the Council of Europe on the joint project We Can for Human Rights Speech, which is being implemented with project partners from Belgium, Italy, and Romania. She writes articles on digital civic courage and hate on the internet, advises civil society and political stakeholders on strategies on how to deal with extremism and hate speech online, and she's recognized internationally as an expert in this field. And finally, we have Erin Saltman. Erin is the Director of Programming at the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. She was formerly Facebook's Head of Counterterrorism and Dangerous Organizations Policy for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. She's also been Senior Research Assistant, I suppose, at the Quilliam Foundation and the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, where she remains a research fellow. Her background and expertise include both far-right and Islamist extremist processes of radicalization within a range of regional and socio-political contexts. Her research and publications have focused on the evolving nature of online extremism and terrorism, gender dynamics within violent extremist organizations, and youth radicalization. And one of her most recent papers she co-authored is titled New Models for Deploying Counterspeech, Measuring Behavioral Change and Sentiment Analysis. So those are our speakers. I'm very happy that all three of you are joining us today for this discussion. I would like to start by asking all three of you one question, or kind of two questions, which is just in a few sentences and in your own words, how would you define counterspeech? And how would you say that the area or field you work in shapes your understanding of counterspeech? So maybe we can start with Amalia.
Sure. Can you hear me correctly? I mean, first of all, I want to apologize for my voice because I got a nasty cold, but I hope you still understand me. So, so for me, counterspeech is any message that directly address a hate comment online. I know this is a very limited definition, and I'm also happy to see that lately other definitions have come into play, like more indirect manners of counter speech, such as, for example, providing public support to the victims of to the targets of these hateful messages, or also more like technical counter speech, how I like to call it, like just blocking people online. But I always use this very limited definition of counter speech because I work from, I'm a sociologist, but I work with experimental methods all the time. So for us, it's really important to have it very clearly defined. So it is measurable. So it is easy to know what you're measuring. So yeah, so my definition, or the working definition, you will see during my presentation, is messages that directly address the perpetrators of hateful messages, especially those messages who serve as a sanction to that type of language, you know, like this is inappropriate, you shouldn't do this, it's unacceptable speech, and so forth.
Thank you. Erin.
I think that a lot of institutes in the last 10 years have started to put forward definitions, but I think we should recognize that the term didn't really exist 15 years ago. I think it's worth saying that this is a newer sector, and it really did come out of an online nexus with extremism. I remember being part of a team that worked with a French group to say, okay, what's the French version of this word? And we ended up with contre-discours. And so whether people have had very big semantic debates over whether we're talking about counter narratives or alternative narratives or counter speech, if you get caught up a little too much in the semantics, you kind of lose the big picture, which is what we're really talking about, is any online or offline strategy that is meant to strategically undermine or refute or provide alternatives to hate-based narratives leading to violence. And so that's really ultimately, we see not just any form of hatred, but hateful narratives, hateful ideologies that are leading towards violence, that are leading towards antagonism of a certain population based on protected categories of people. And the reason why even calling it speech is almost a misnomer is because we shouldn't limit how this manifests. A lot of it is visual and symbolic. A lot of it is through protest. A lot of it is through symbols, slogans, and slurs. And a lot of it takes video form, image form, text form, taking online events and turning them into offline events. And so it's quite porous. And almost by over-defining it, you stop activism from manifesting it in all these different ways. So if you look in different parts of the world, we should see it as an umbrella term to really catch a bunch of different types of efforts that usually civil society, in partnership with others, perhaps in partnership with governments or tech companies, are putting out there to undermine hate-based narratives and pathways. My background comes from originally an academic background, but actually working as a practitioner for many years, working within a tech company, and now working with a multitude of tech companies. So I think one of the things we'll try to land, or that I'll try to land in the presentation I give, is that the civil society voice will always be the most potent, will always be the most compelling one to try to push back on hate. Government voices or private company voices are not the sexy voice to push back on hate that exists in society. However, when we see partnerships with bigger institutions, with tech companies, with governments, that's when you have the strategy to upskill, and optimize those civil society voices. So it's not just deployed through a holistic mechanism, but actually proactively through tooling or through other methodologies that can scale it up strategically. Otherwise, it doesn't usually get support. And so we'll see examples where it can have a groundswell without the support of government or private industry. We can look at movements that started very holistically, like whether we're talking about Bring Back Our Girls or Me Too or Black Lives Matter. And then usually you get governments and private industry latching onto it to try to help boost it up afterwards. So there's examples of the holistic approach, and then there's examples of strategy by design.
Great, thank you very much. Sina.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for having me. And I'm so happy to meet these amazing women on the panel, virtual panel with me. Yeah, so as far as my definition for counterspeech go, usually in workshops, and I've seen this with a lot of colleagues as well, they are usually using the more limited definition that Amalia mentioned, that is just a direct response to a hateful comment, then is counterspeech. But working in this field as a practitioner for the last 5 years, I think counterspeech, as Erin mentioned, this should be considered an umbrella term, and a lot of activities that we are doing to promote human rights online should like fall into this sphere as well, or into this space as well. So being an active counter speaker, I don't know, that's a very German way to say that, would be not just to respond to a hateful comment, but also to, for example, as Erin mentioned, go to the streets and protest, but also promote more human messages or empathetic messages, to spread love, and not just be this, well, reactive message, but also being, oh my God, I hate that term, a proactive message as well, that promotes human rights and human dignity. And counterspeech can also be a very, well, what might seem a passive way to respond to just report a comment, for example, or just in Germany now we can file lawsuits with the Network Enforcement Act as well, which in my opinion should also be considered a form of counterspeech as well, because it's something, you are doing something, and a lot of people that I work with and that I know that want to be active on social media are afraid to be active and are afraid to be an active counter speaker. And there I did it again. So for them, the term counter speech might sometimes be discouraging because it really asks them to be super active on social media, and they might not have the confidence to do that. So I think counter speech should be the definition of counter speech should be a bit more, well, wider, if you could say it like that, and just cover different aspects.
Thank you so much. I think we've already heard 3 very, very helpful and insightful definitions or forms of understanding counterspeech. And I hope we're going to talk a bit more about this in the discussion. The way we set out this session is that we're now going to have a presentation by Amalia. And then we're going to move on to the discussion after that, to a more open discussion. So Amalia, feel free to share your screen, and then Zoom is yours, I guess.
Okay, here we go. Okay. Yeah, so first of all, just say that I'm very happy I'm going to present here, because normally I always present in more academic context. So this is an opportunity to me to understand how counter speech and hate speech is understood in the outside world, outside the academia, and I really, really appreciate this. And I also hope that you can find, as practitioners, you can find my work interesting to apply it to the real world outside. So I'm interested in hate speech because I do research on social norms, and there is this idea from social psychology and from political science and also sociology, is that the expression of prejudice is regulated by social norms. And with this, I mean that in general, a majority of people would agree that expressing prejudice and bigoted attitudes in public is non-acceptable, also is inappropriate. And these norms, they develop over the last 50 decades of the past century, and they were really important in shaping political discourses, what you can say in public, what you cannot say, whether people will vote for you as a leader if you say certain things. So I found this type of anti-prejudice norms fascinating. They've taken many different norms, egalitarian norms of egalitarian expression, tolerant norms, anti-racism norms. It depends on the author. And the main idea of this is that people will only express the inner prejudice if they believe that the social norms are more permissive in their local context. So if they believe that this type of ideas would be accepted in the local context, otherwise they will tend to refrain from expressing these hateful ideas. And we have seen, so this is based on an idea from social norms research, which is called conditional preference. And this just means that people tend to follow the norm or a given norm only if they believe others are also going to follow it. So if they believe that others will express prejudice in a local context, they will more prone to do it as well. If they believe that if they do so, they will be thrown upon or sanctioned or pinpointed, that they will refrain from expressing these attitudes. And so most of my research has been done in this field, just understanding whether, exposing people to hateful messages would bring about more hate from the observers. And just to give you an example, this is from a forum in which we had participants invited over, and some of the participants, they could observe prejudice, they could observe xenophobic messages, and some of the participants could not observe prejudice, xenophobic messages. In this case, it was only anti-immigrant and xenophobic messages, because it was an online experiment in which they were asked to comment on pictures on refugees and immigrants in Germany. And people were also classified based on whether they displayed an anti-immigrant inner attitude or not. So whether they had a positive or negative attitude towards immigration. And here you can see that, of course, there is a magnitude effect. People who had a more anti-immigration attitude, they tend to express more hateful regardless. But what you can observe here is that when you expose people to xenophobic messages, both anti and pro-immigration people, they tend to express more xenophobic messages as well. And based into that discovery, we develop different interventions to try to curb online hate speech. And these interventions are based also in this social norms paradigm. So what we do is we either censor previous hate speech, or we let our participants observe previous counter speech. So we let them observe that previous users in the online forum, they have reacted negatively, and they try to undermine these hateful messages. And just quick definition, the way we use hateful message in this context is always messages that are attacking protected categories. In this case, we had immigration, LGBTQ people, and women. So just to give you a short introduction to the experimental paradigm we use, we have designed our own online forum. You will find that the forum is rather simple, and this is done in purpose because the more simple something is, the easier for us it is to control what people are seeing or not seeing in the forum. So we can have we achieve better causal inference, because you will find that my work, so our work is it doesn't have too many subtleties, it is very much to the point. Things are very well limited, defined, and this is because the positive aspect of this work is that it allows for causal inference. So we have this rather simplified version of what an online forum is, which is always the same. We always have a picture on top, and then we ask people coming into the forum to please discuss, give us comments on the picture and on the comment thread underneath the picture. The comment thread is also manipulated by us. All comments, everything is everything is real. It's just comments were collected in previous pre-experimental sessions, and they don't happen in real time, but they are all real comments. So what we do is we manipulate the amount of comments that the participants can see that are hateful comments or not. So you can either see only one comment being xenophobic, either two, or all comments being xenophobic, and then we let participants just interact by giving us a further comment in the online forum. So as I said before, we implemented different treatments. Here we have the baseline one. Those are all like translation for the real German messages. In the baseline one, we have no manipulation whatsoever, so we didn't implement any treatment. And here, all participants can see 6 different comments, in which 2 comments were like hateful ones, 2 comments were neutral ones, and 2 comments were like friendly comments toward the target group represented in the picture on top. Sorry. And then we have the extremely censor condition, in which also the neutral comments are taken out, and participants can only see positive messages towards the target, the social targets represented by the picture. And then we have the counter-speech treatment, in which the hateful comments are always shown next to a simple comment that is that addresses the user who gave the hateful message. And as I said, because this is an experimental, because our main aim is to have like a clear causal inference in this experiment, counter-speech is defined as an informal sanction, reminding the hateful commenter that they shouldn't use this type of language in here. So we randomized participants among the different treatments, and we have 9 different online discussions in which they have to participate. Those are in 4 different topics. So we collected almost 1,500 different comments from all the participants. And now what we wanted to do is we wanted to analyze those comments, because they are the measures that we use to analyze whether the treatments work or did not work. And the different measures that we have is we have a continuous hate score, in which we ask our raters to please assign a score from 1 to 9, being 1 friendly towards the target of hate, and 9 extremely hostile towards the target of hate. And we also have a binary measure in which we ask people to please let us know whether they think that the user that left the message should be banned from the forum based on how hostile their messages were. And what we find is that censoring hate speech, so not allowing participants to actually observe previous users' hateful messages, that has a strong effect on the comments from our participants, in that it reduced the overall level of hostility in the comments of these participants. On the other hand, observing counter-speech didn't have this effect. It didn't have this effect, but I want you to be positive in this. This doesn't mean that counter-speech does not work, because just remember that in this experiment, people were not targeted by counter-speakers. They just could observe that other people were being counter-spoken on. So we found that we found more polarization in this counter-speech treatment. When participants could observe that there were like a bunch of counter-speakers, addressing previous hateful users, they became more polarized. So we find that people either commented in a very friendly manner, or they commented in a very hateful manner. And this is why overall there is no effect of observing counter-speech. Same goes for the binary measurement. Only censoring previous hate content had a clear effect on had a clear effect on the number of the frequency of comments that were actually in the frequency of users that were actually banned from the forum. And both observing counter-speech and extremely censor didn't have that effect, again, because it increases polarization of people. Also, observing only extremely censor will also brought about more polarization from people. And okay, so after that, what we did relating to counter-speech is we wanted to know whether these dynamics of social norms, that is observing the behavior of others, also had an effect on the likelihood of counter-speaking. So we wanted to see whether observing hateful messages online would increase the likelihood of people spontaneously counter-speaking those messages. So in this case, what we did is we recruited how many? We recruited 2,000 participants, and more than 2,800, if I recall correctly. So we recruited 2,000 participants, and then asked them to please give us comments in 5 different forums. And the idea of these forums, in this case, the forum is only about immigration. The idea of this forum is that participants will go forward on the forum, and as long as they go forward on it, the amount of xenophobic comments will increase. And the idea is to see whether participants will spontaneously try to counter speak these hateful messages, and they do. So in the first forum, like, there is no hateful comment, there is also no counter speak, of course. And then as xenophobic messages increase, also participants increase the frequency of counter speech messages. And the nice thing that you can see here is that the election, so the election to counter speak is also very linked to the personal attitude of the commenter on the target of prejudice. So people who were classified as having a negative attitude towards immigrants, they decided not to do any counter speech comment, while people who had a positive attitude towards immigration, they were the more vocal when it came to enacting counter speech. And I think one thing that I like a lot, and I think is really useful, what we did after this is, because as I said before, a main idea of social norms is that people tend to to look around and see what people are doing in the local context, and then they will take the pattern of behavior as the normalized behavior. I wanted to know whether observing counter speech in the local context in these forums actually increases the likelihood of people also using counter speech as a tool for retaliation. Because in general, what I found in survey experiments and with survey data is that people tend to refrain from counter speaking because they have fear of retaliation. No, they think, okay, if this person is giving these very hateful comments online, this may also mean that if I speak against them, they will more probably just retaliate against me and be violent or aggressive against me. And I always found that this actually impedes that counter speech increases. So here you can see people who were interacting in a forum in which they could observe counter speech, that's the blue participants, and in a forum in which they could not observe counter speech, this is the red participants. And what I want you to understand from this plot is that observing other people counter speaking increased the number of counter speech messages per se, but it also increased the number of people who left at least one counter speech message, you know. So in general, people who counter speech, in my experiments, counter speech messages that tend to be concentrated into a few participants. So there are a few participants that they counter speech more, and once they do it once, then they do it all the time. So one very nice thing about this is that observing counter speech in your local environment not only increases the total number of counter speech messages, but it also increases the number of people who jump into, you know, fighting or trying to counteract prejudice. And I think this was all from me. It was all from my presentation. And I think my main message would be that social norms dynamics should take into account when designing interventions to curb online hate speech, especially you know, unintended consequences or effects of these policies, such as, for example, increased polarization. And I just want to thank you for having me here today and listening to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amalia, for this great presentation. If you have a question, then keep it in mind, please, because we're gonna move straight on to Erin, because she also wants to share a few slides and has prepared a short presentation. So Erin, if you're ready, you can share your screen.
Sure. I just think, you know, some of this is just much easier to visualize, especially when we're talking about results from this sort of training. And so I'll try to make it really quick to try to get through some data and facts, but hopefully it just helps kind of convey what we're really talking about, and especially target audiences, because I think some of the testing that I was able to do at my time at Facebook, and we can talk about what that looks and feels like in the Q&A, but it meant that we could actually go through quite a lot of ethical, legal, and privacy concerns and reviews of how data should be deployed in the wild, in the actual online space in different ways, and then how we can yield results and make sure that we have do no harm principles. I think there's been a lot of concern in recent years as well to make sure that if you are going to go out for all the right intentions, that your activities online have some sort of methodology to ensure you're not harming the at-risk audiences that oftentimes you're trying to reach as well. And that's definitely something to take into consideration. I mean, for anyone that has never heard of the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, it's a bit of a unique institute because we were founded by YouTube, Microsoft, Twitter, and Facebook in 2017 as a by tech for tech initiative, but now we have quite a good handful of tech companies, some that maybe you think of when you think of extremism online, but some that you maybe don't, like Airbnb or Just Paste It or Mega or MailChimp. And so all these different platforms see hate and extremism on their platforms in different ways, or Amazon. Some of them are very big, but don't necessarily have counter-extremism teams in-house as part of their staff, or are just realizing they have to build that out as a capacity. And one of the main 4 core areas of work is really where can we see shared technological solutions? So some of the counter speech feeds into that. And then where can we get better multi-sector collaboration and knowledge sharing? So the tools that tech companies have, oftentimes what was originally developed for ads marketing campaigns to scale up and sell Nike shoes or Coca-Cola, we can actually reappropriate some of those toolings to help us target audiences online with counter speech or counter messaging or alternative messaging. And we can get much better measurement and evaluation in very rapid time frames compared to, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago, definitely 10 years ago, when you'd have to run a trial and wait months to get back results, to get statistically significant results back. And actually in the online space, within a week or 2, you can very quickly see some pretty significant results and actually change the way that you're doing counter speech according with those results. I'll share in the chat the research paper that I'm going to talk through some of the results with, because I love giving people homework, and also it's easier for you to follow on and have the link and read it in your own time as bedtime reading. But when we're really talking about, does counterspeech work, we're asking two main questions of ourselves as practitioners. We're saying, okay, has what I've put in the online space changed your behavior? So have you, to some of Amalia's data points, have you stopped bad behavior, or have you picked up good behavior? And then a secondary question is, have I changed your mind? Have you become less hateful? And I want to be very clear that these are two very different things, because maybe I scared you online and you thought, okay, I need to change my behavior or else I'm going to be kicked off. That's very different than changing your mind, but it's a net positive for the internet if you stop using hate speech online. But we need to talk about what is behavior and what is sentiment. And this can be very difficult to measure. Oftentimes, counterspeech is usually just measuring reach and engagement. So how many people did I expose to my counterspeech, and did they react to it? So in comments, you can do discourse analysis and get to that a little bit, but some of the newer methodologies allow for a deeper image of behavior and sentiment. So I always want to first ask any practitioner or activist, who exactly are you trying to reach? And this is sometimes a question that a lot of activists that have been working a long time haven't actually posed to themselves. They know that they know their message and they know they want to counter hate, but there's a huge difference between trying to reach young people to make them naturally resilient to hate speech or make them more inoculated against extremist ideologies. That's a very different approach and audience compared to if you're trying to target somebody that is already got a swastika tattoo, or that is a member of a violent extremist organization and is participating and inciting violence. Those are two very different audiences, and there's a lot of in between. We might also be wanting to target the initial sympathizers, that friend that you have that just started sharing some content saying, well, we should be questioning this. Maybe immigrants are taking our jobs. That person is maybe a borderline case. That's also a very different approach to how you would communicate with them and how you might want to approach them and what their pathway is away from that. So that's why I say, first thing we do is we question what's your actual audience, and you should be curating the content based on who your audience is. Prevention content is very different to strategic counter content that is trying to reach somebody already embedded within a violent ideology. It also means your audience size changes. Wider society prevention content, you want to reach lots of people, actual individuals that are already adhering to a violent ideology or hate-based ideology is a much smaller group of people. And then there's a lot of noise in between. But with online tooling, you can actually target based on likes, interests, and behaviors. That's how people target your ads for getting you to buy clothing. And you can actually reappropriate some of that to think through counter-speech campaigns. Now, two methodologies that are a little newer in the space that I want to discuss very quickly. One is, how do you trigger proactive surfacing of counterspeech based on user behavior online? And so the first methodology I was able to test during my time, and it was not just me, it was a huge team, including NGO partnerships. The first question we asked is, how much would you have to see counterspeech for how often for you to change your mind at all? And we worked with some incredible Stanford master's students. I always say, if you want dedicated work, partner with master's students. And they tested in more of kind of a Amalia style setting, tested A/B testing of rate and frequency. So how often for how long would you have to see something contradicting or giving you a different perspective? And their results ultimately showed that when they worked with us, that you would have to see 2 to 3 pieces of content a day for about 5 to 7 days to start getting some sentiment differential. And so that's what we based our target on. So that was done in their own A/B testing. And then we took that on as a baseline to test on Facebook. So we worked with 3 different NGOs, and we wanted to test in 2 different languages. So we looked at English UK language market and Arabic Iraqi language market for this first testing. And we wanted to also be transparent. So we also didn't want to be covert if Facebook was helping sponsor the redirection of this content. So it did have a labeling on it, basically saying that Facebook was partnering with the NGO. And so we used the holistic NGO content from 3 different organizations in 2 different languages to target audiences, and they were targeted based on a bad actor behavior. So based on the fact that they had shared a piece of already labeled terrorist content in the past week. So that meant that they had given us a behavioral signal of sympathy, of enough of a behavioral signal to share a piece of known labeled terrorist content that had been removed. And then that would mean this would trigger them getting the content for 2 to 3 pieces of content a day for 5 to 7 days. So it's really fascinating to kind of see, okay, what does that mean at scale? Now, by the way, to A/B test this, it meant that we had identified over the period it was running, identified 74,000 profiles that had shared a piece of terrorist content in these 2 markets. And so the A/B test, the A side is that this was triggered to 37,000 individuals. So that's the A/B test. So again, online, you get much higher numbers than you usually can in some academic studies. Now, what we found was really interesting. Statistically, in the initial review, we didn't find it hugely statistically conclusive. We saw these little shifts, but it didn't show us maybe as much as we'd want to. And so we have to think of quantitative versus qualitative analysis here, because we then worked with a qualitative researcher and we started looking through the noise of some of the profiles. And something really important to recognize is that a lot of very good actors share very bad content for good reasons. And so what we first found is that a lot of people that had got caught up in this because they'd shared terrorist content were also journalists, were also academics, were also researchers and practitioners that oftentimes were sharing content that was violating content, but they were sharing it sometimes to raise awareness or to show that this was happening and that it was wrong, or even people from the community to say that this content was horrible. So we started teasing out the noise. And what we found is with the group that we saw were actually sympathizers, that we could say, looking at wider profile, that they were actually indeed sympathizers. After this control treatment, they almost never shared violating content again, which was hugely significant, because usually once you start sharing bad content, it's a snowball effect and eventually you get kicked off the platform for violations. And so for that hardest to reach audience that were core believers and sympathizers, after the treatment, they no longer shared. Now, again, that could be because of a Facebook treatment. They thought, okay, I'm being monitored now, so I don't want to share any more content. So that is a behavior change, but we're not sure of it being a sentiment change. I think this kind of keys on the fact that everyone, when they deploy things online, they think they want to reach the broadest audience possible because the numbers look good. But in fact, they probably really want to be refined in how they think of an audience. And it's usually not just off of one signal, because that can still bring a lot of false positives. Now, the second methodology, maybe some people have heard of search redirect. But this idea is that, again, a user behavior triggers a reaction, and this is based on search. So search can be done on Google search, on YouTube, on Facebook. People look in very different ways on search. So on Google, maybe you're looking for resources or cooking recipes or whatever else. On Facebook, you're usually looking for people or groups. That's how people query. And so we partnered with, in this test case, a group of former extremists that have a practitioner unit in the US called Life After Hate. So they run a disengagement or de-radicalization program. And we worked with them to develop an online treatment so that if you searched for white supremacy or neo-Nazi terms in America, that it would pop up a treatment that would allow you to go to the Life After Hate website as your first search result. So it wouldn't mean that, and it would also say that the search query was related to dangerous organizations. And what we found is that when we plugged in and we worked with the NGO on what those terms should be, there was a huge increase in new user traffic to their website when this was launched. Now, initially we thought, okay, maybe there's some media around it, so that's a null void spike. But afterwards, you could see that on average, 200 new individuals would go to their site and maintain activity on their website. They also doubled the amount of individuals that not only went to their website, but reached out asking for help to leave a white supremacy or neo-Nazi organization. So their physical number of people that they could give support to directly doubled because of this online search redirect treatment. This has since expanded to a couple other countries that have NGOs that do similar, in Germany, in Indonesia, and in Australia. And so again, when we think of redirection, the point is to have a query bring you some curated or redirectional results that lead you away from what you were originally searching for and actually provide you an alternative that leads you to an NGO that gives resources or gives help. This kind of also points to the fact that what do you do once you undermine somebody's violent extremist ideology? So you've just said you're wrong, and then they go, okay, well, now what? You actually need to provide support networks or provide real world or localized outlets for somebody to engage. It is one thing to undermine somebody's belief, and it is another to try to provide a support network and an alternative to that. And lastly, you know, just from lots of research, a lot of times practitioners, naturally so it's not their field, are not really good at marketing. And so they have really good offline campaigns, but sort of fail in the online space. And reminders for anyone looking to do their own online campaigns: things need to stay conversational. They need to feel authentic. Oftentimes campaigns fail because they look like they cost too much money or because they're linked to something too fancy. They need to be highly visual. So text-based versus having a photo or video goes 60 to 80% further. They also need to be very simple. So as an academic, I had to conform my lengthy rants into very small, quippy texts. And they need to be timely. So if you're trying to get someone to turn away from hate, why should they do that today? Like, we've got laundry and taxes and classes and whatever else. And so actually tying it to a real world event or something in the news, or getting somebody to realize that it relates to them today is important. The last thing is that oftentimes people make very pretty things that look really beautiful on your 13+-inch computer, and then most younger people are looking at it on this size. So getting activists to realize they have to make it phone friendly as a visual and put subtitles because you're not always plugged into the sound are actually just some basic things that help content go further in this sort of space. I'll share a member resource guide that we put together. So for all the 17 companies that are GIFCT members, we actually brought together all of the links to their transparency reports and safety hubs. Oftentimes activists are not very good with their own personal safety. They're very dedicated and emotional, and then they get trolled or they don't understand their own privacy settings, and then they can be attacked online by trying to counter a hateful group. So there's a lot of tools on counter-narrative facilitation and digital literacy, as well as safety. So I'll share a link if people are interested to kind of have a look through that as well. And then lastly, I would just say that some of those links also give how to operationalize and use platform analytics, and they talk about NGO support. So as I said, a lot of this very fancy data that used to be very hard to get 10 years ago is so much easier to get online. You can actually see how many people are looking at it on a mobile device versus a laptop or computer, how many percentiles women versus men. You can get some geographic distribution as well. So you really can understand quickly. You can also see in a video when people drop out of your content. So if you made a beautiful 3-minute video and it's only in the last 30 seconds that you make your point and everyone dropped out after 30 seconds, then they missed your point. So it actually helps you tailor your videos. I say, if you want a really good video, make it less than a minute. And if you really want it to land, make it 10 seconds. And that's meant to redirect people to more information. So that could just be the intro to get someone hooked, to bring them to more information. And then lastly, I'll share a link to the campaign toolkit. So it actually helps guide activists through these different platforms of what resources are available to you, and helps you curate or at least focus your ideas on strategizing an online campaign. So I'll give a link. That's available in 5 different languages at the moment, hopefully more later. But hopefully some of you have a play around and give some feedback if you think it's useful or not. Okay, that's it from me.
Sorry, took me a long time to find my microphone button. Thank you very much, Erin, for this very interesting insight into your work as well. And before we actually open the discussion, of course, I want to give Sina the opportunity as well to maybe tell us a bit more about your experiences with, because I know you also work in a more practical approach to online hate speech and counter speech, and yeah, maybe tell us a bit more about that, or if you already want to comment to Amalia's or Erin's talks, then feel free to do so as well.
Oh, I'd love to comment, but I've learned so much just in the last 20 minutes, I think. Just listening to the both of you has been great. I didn't prepare a presentation, just some remarks that I want to add. And I think it connects quite well to Erin's presentation, actually, when she talked about you have to know your audience, who you try to address with your counter speech. And I think there's a step before that you have to think about already is what's the goal? What do you want to do with the counter speech? Is it to convince someone else to change their mind, to change their attitude, to change their behavior? And then we go to all the steps that Erin just outlined. Or is it just to show the wider public that you don't agree with that you are sending a message of support to the person that is targeted by hate speech or by digital violence? Yeah, so I think that's a step that you have to take before, because then this really defines also the strategy you're using. If you really try to convince someone, at least in my experience in the past, it's keep repeating your message, take a lot of time, like a lot. And it is going to be one-on-one time with this one person that you are trying to convince. It's not going to happen if you're just sending out and blurting out any kind of message. If you are in these one-on-one conversations, you have to take the time. And in the past 4 or 5 years with the no hate speech movement, it has not happened a lot of times that someone actually said, oh, yeah, I see your point and I agree with you now. It took a long time to get there. And I think what a lot of activists are doing is just to show that they are not agreeing with a certain message, with a certain narrative, and try to be supportive of the person that is targeted by hate speech. And that's a completely different approach. And then I've seen already some questions in the chat that people are asking, yeah, but then should you be more fun or more ironic, or should it be fact-based or anything? And that's, I think, that really depends on what you're trying to reach and who you're trying to reach as well. And then when you're, for example, if you're trying to reach the wider public, I've seen a lot of accounts, at least in Germany, then being humorous and fun and ironic, which just attracts a lot of support. And people are usually putting a like button right there the same second that they see it. While trying to convince someone to change their mind, you would be maybe a little bit less, let's say, aggressive, and more empathetic and trying to see their point and just be a bit more, well, approachable, maybe that's the right term. Yeah, so that's all the remarks I had for now, and I'm really happy to have the Q&A now, or the panel discussion, or whatever you want to call it.
Yes, thank you very much, Sina. Yeah, I can already see that we've had a few questions in the chat, and Amalia has been answering some of them. Thank you for that. So if you have a question at this point, or also if you want to ask your question in person, then please just use the raised hand function. I would suggest, I mean, also I can see that there are some speakers from the other sessions here as well. So I don't know if any of you have any questions already at this point. Please let me know. Otherwise, I'm just going to ask a question, I suppose, as long as we, or while we wait. And I think you already, all of you, addressed this, and this is kind of, Sina just mentioned it. So in everything we've read so far about counter speech, there's always been the question of what is actually most effective, and actually seeing that in some contexts, certain topics kind of require a different response, or in certain communities, a humorous response is more effective than a, let's say, purely factual response. So I've read some research that suggests that within the LGBTQ plus community, humorous responses tend to be rather effective. Whereas, of course, if you want to tackle something like anti-Semitism, humorous responses will not be very appropriate, and sort of like a more educational, factual response will be more suited. I don't know if any of you want to comment more on that.
Yeah, I think, again, this goes to Sina's point as well about who you're trying to reach. So humor is very effective in prevention, in dissuading others if you want to undermine the original intention to join one of these groups or sympathize. So kind of humoristically or sarcastically undermining the credibility of a group with a younger audience, or with an audience that was maybe playing like, oh, what's that group? Who is that? I'm curious. Humor can work to kind of dissuade that and undermine it. If you go in to somebody that is a dedicated follower of a group and try to use humor to undermine their very core ideology, it's very, you're very quickly going to probably get attacked online. And so humor in the prevention space, to relate to young people, to get some quippy responses, humor goes really far. It has wide reach, but whether or not it's reaching your intended target audience is usually questionable. So it's very shareable, using memes, making very quippy, shareable content. It will get shared a lot, but you have to question whether or not it's being shared within your own echo chamber of people that already believe in what you believe, or if you're trying to actually reach people that are outside of your network that might disagree with you. One amazing piece of research done by, I'll think of the name in a second, looked at just how some of the white supremacy manosphere groups online shared content. And they actually shared a lot of liberal news media. They shared a lot of New York Times, and they shared a lot of, and they ripped it to shreds. And so one of the other arguments people make is, well, if they just stopped listening to their news and listened to more centrist liberal news, then they would just change their mind. And actually, if it's not packaged in a way that has a cognitive opening to that audience, it will fail. And Stephen Colbert, not an academic, but good at reaching people, once said, it's not about truth, it's about truthiness. And especially in this kind of age of misinformation overlapping with violent extremist groups, something has to inherently feel true to you first before you even provided a cognitive opening to listen to it. And so more than the substance, sometimes it's about the packaging, especially online, to reach a target audience. And I would say that we all have our cognitive bias. So like, I am extremely biased as well towards things based on my already solidified ideas. And so we all have to recognize this is not just about extremists. We are in quite a well-packaged world where things are packaged to us as audiences. And so I think, to maybe Sina's point, having a little bit of empathy about understanding who your target audience is first is very important to know how to package it. And from communications lessons, we also know that you have to have the message, the messenger, and the platform in alignment. So you could have a great message, but if it's not from a credible messenger, it will fail. Or you could have the right messenger and the right message, but you posted on Facebook and they're all on TikTok. So who are you trying to reach? So actually knowing the platforms to reach out on and then tying those three together is really important.
Maybe I can comment on that a little bit too, also to reply a comment that it's on the chat. Yeah, so in this line, I also think that the effect of counter speaking would depend a lot in what you want to target with a counter speech. And one division that is really important to me is whether you're trying to be persuasive or not. I mean, is your main goal, is your ulterior goal to actually change these people ideas, or do you want, for example, just keep your social platform free of hateful content? Because those are completely different things. And for example, if what you want is to persuasion, is a completely different process, and it is related, in my opinion, to this polarization effect that I found in my research, and that it's been found by other researchers before, because in general, and as the last comment in the chat said, people when they are faced with with a different opinion, or people trying to counteract the, or refute the arguments, they tend to get really defensive. Mostly, and it's just a hypothesis, because also these opinions is whether you are hateful or not on the online settings, is also linked to your identity, to your political identity, your partisanship identity and stuff. And people tend to be really defensive of their identity. So if you are going to get any persuasion effect whatsoever, that would be in the long run. As far as data normally tells me that in the moment, if you use Counterspeech, what you get is polarization. And that also reminds me of this paper published a couple of years ago, in which, if you expose people to arguments, so if you expose Republicans with Democratic arguments and the other way around, what you get is people that are more polarized, not less polarized. So exposition to arguments from a different outgroup just brings more polarization. Just brings on more polarization. Thank you.
There has been another question in the chat that I'm just going to read out. This is based on Sina's comment. When it comes to reaching people at a personal level, how scalable or automated maybe can these interventions be? I suspect that people would react different to a moderator bot versus a human comment.
I'm sure you both have something smart to say about that, but I can just, well, I don't mean, that sounds so ironic and sarcastic, and don't mean it like that at all. It's just like, from a personal experience, as soon as people suspect you're a bot, they usually drop out of the conversation, or at least that has been my experience. But I by no means have a representative number of people I talk to that way, because, as I said, it's a lot of work and I'm just one person. But I think as soon as it seems automated, it's like the barrier increase or goes up again, because already taking the step to be open for a conversation and a dialogue is a big step, and then you get the feeling, or what is shown to you is that you're not being taken seriously, and people are just letting a bot answer you. So I think having an automated response might make it harder to have these one-on-one conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in and just say chat and chat bots are really difficult. Like, what we were doing in proactive surfacing was not a bot. It was actually just a function based on a behavior. And so the content we were surfacing was actually localized or based from NGOs. So it was authentic content. But what a tech company could do is make sure that it was upscaled and optimized and targeted correctly, because oftentimes the activists and practitioners find it very difficult to know how to use online tools or to target it adequately. I would say that that does mean that at scale, you need to at least have some parameters around it. So the content you're curating to be redirected or to be optimized needs to at least be localized by geography and the violent extremist ideology that you're countering. So countering an Islamist extremist messaging is going to look a little different to countering white supremacy messaging, is going to look a little different to countering Buddhist extremist messaging in Myanmar. And so there has to be some language, geography, and ideology bucketing. But within that, you can curate sort of quote unquote playlists of localized NGO content to curate. The ultimate goal would be to turn passive online scrolling into an active conversation. That's when you actually get depth to your metrics. That's when you can see behavior or sentiment changing, is because you turn something passive into something active. And when we look at how violent extremist groups recruit, it is exactly by turning something passive, like posting something and waiting for comments, and then turning those comments into an active dialogue. That's how recruitment operationalizes. So the point is to counteract that with similar dynamism. Most counterspeech kind of leaves it as passive content. So it means when you're working with an NGO, you also have to talk to them about what capacity they have to engage online. So when we did the redirection with the US-based NGO around white supremacy, it was impossible to know exactly how much the online triggering of this would lead to more people going in their direction. And we actually had to support them more financially than originally intended because of doubling the amount of capacity of people coming in. We actually had to help support them hiring some more people. So that's also a consideration, is that when you look at scale, you have to think of human cost, because the ultimate is actually not that it's an online engagement, it has real world ramifications. So I would just say that that's really important to consider. And then also, yeah, bots. Twitter has tested some weird bots where, like, if you posted certain slur terms, it would automatically turn them into lovey-dovey terms. There's been some testing with this, with, again, usually not great results, because the extremists themselves would mock it or undermine it or reappropriate it or find workarounds or use coded language. And so those don't tend to have the best results.
Yes, Ray, you have a question or a comment?
Yes, thank you very much. This has been so interesting. I just want to follow up with, I mean, it's partly a question about effectiveness, but but in some ways there are normative issues in the background here. I'm wondering how the perception that you're being manipulated affects how you respond. And this ties in with the previous question about, you know, whether you're being talked to by a human or a machine, or, I mean, when people feel like they're, I mean, I think there's evidence, empirical evidence, even though I'm a philosopher, I'll mention it, that says that when people feel like they're being manipulated, they respond in a negative way and feel like they, you know, they don't have a choice in what's going on. And some of the studies you've mentioned talk about treatment. Now, this idea about treatment, with my philosopher's hat on, this looks like, you know, as if you're medically treating someone, or as if you're, you know, someone has an illness and you're treating it as a disease that needs to be cured. And that sounds very different to, you know, two human beings arguing with each other. And so I just wondered how you know, how we address that challenge of, you know, thinking of this as dialogue between, you know, that's a meaningful conversation, and how we think of it as, you know, an illness that you treat, because that seems like a very different picture of how we engage with human beings.
I mean, I can jump in to just let you know that a lot of CVE language has talked about it in terms of inoculation and in terms of building up natural resilience. I won't use the term herd immunity because I don't think that's quite applicable, but actually a lot of practitioners do talk about it in the prevention space. When you look at a lot of the online youth engagement programs, it is about creating natural resilience, inoculating youth so that they understand, and it's done through storytelling usually. So for example, ISD Global, Institute for Strategic Dialogue, they have something called Extreme Dialogue. And it's something whereby they take the stories of former extremists and survivors of extremism, and they do a storytelling format to have videos of those formers talking about how they got involved and how they left. And then they use Q&A tactics with the teachers to have a dialogue with the students to create a natural empathy and understanding about that process and create natural resiliency through storytelling. So a lot of online, offline programs do talk about inoculation. So it's about exposure in advance of trying to be recruited, or in advance of even seeing the hate or extremism, to create that resilience. So it doesn't necessarily mean that that language means it's not a community dialogue attached to the approach. I would say there's also some bad counter speech out there. I'm not here to out what that looks like, but usually that takes place when somebody not from a community tries to think that they are targeting an at-risk community that they don't know or that they don't have any relation to. There's some orientalization to that. That's when things go wrong. So if you don't have localized partnerships or localized understanding, at least to work with and partner with, that's when counter speech goes wrong. But I do think that, you know, violent extremist groups are suspicious by nature. There's a lot of conspiracy theories attached to those groups. And so the packaging, again, I think Sina had mentioned and Amalia had mentioned, understanding who you're trying to reach and packaging information in a way that has a cognitive opening to that group is the only way to reach them. Again, prevention and wider dialogues, preventative work looks very different to targeting individuals that are already embedded within a violent extremist group, and what you consider an at-risk audience. Again, some people consider just youth an at-risk audience. That's very different to somebody that's already sharing information related to a certain group.
Thank you.
I don't know if Amalia or Sina want to add anything, or no, I don't see a question at the moment or a raised hand, so I'm just going to ask a question that I'm kind of interested in. So what we've also heard in some of your presentations is that, and what I've read in different research articles, is that it can be quite difficult for an individual person or user to actually just step up and use Counterspeech on their own when they're online on Twitter or Facebook or any other social media platform. And I've been thinking, is there any kind of way that we could use technology to kind of help people make that first step of like interfering, countering when they observe something or when they observe hateful dialogue, might not necessarily be directed towards them, but you've also mentioned proactiveness being important, and like just standing up for people, minority groups, etc. Yeah, is there anything you can think of? I've just been thinking of maybe like some technology that could help you with a prompt to say like, this is how you could reply to this. This is how you could counter this form of comment.
If I may. Yeah, so there have been some advances, I think, at least in the civil society sector. So first of all, I think if you want to get active, if you want to get involved, if you want to learn how to debate and argue, there are so many organizations now offering training courses, either online or also in person. Well, now most of them are online, as we all know why, which I think are really beneficial. For example, the Facing Facts courses by Seji are really great, and you get to learn about different forms of hate speech or online harms and how to best counter it. You get to connect to activists, at least in the EU or Europe-wide. And there have been also some other advancements. For example, in Germany, I remember there has been actually a bot programmed for activists to try to counter negative stereotypical comments targeting refugees or the Muslim communities that they launched right before Christmas, because they said, yeah, probably around the Christmas table, there will be some weird uncle saying some weird stuff and you want to respond to that. And here are some of the most common comments or most common sayings that people say in regards to refugees or Muslims, and that's how you can best respond, and that's some data you can drop on them and so on. And then there has been another project that I've been involved in the past year, which is Detect Then Act, that they developed an AI platform data board that filters out some keywords on Twitter and then shows you those comments, and everything is completely anonymous, and then you get to respond to those comments from an anonymous account. And they also provide some, here are some memes that you can use in this situation, here are some GIFs that you can use in this situation, those are some phrases that you could use and that might come in handy. All of this has been tested with some activists or people that are interested in becoming activists or active upstanders, as they called it in the project. The project Detect and Act now ended, as far as I know, but I know that they are still working with this board and trying to improve it to actually have this as a training tool for future activists or current activists, for people that want to get involved in dialogues. And that's, for example, one thing I can think of that technology can help you to practice to become a better counterspeaker or to become a counterspeaker.
Yeah, thank you. That's very useful. Also, Ray just wrote in the chat, Sina, if you have a link, if you could post it in the chat. I suppose that relates to some of the initiatives you mentioned. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else wanted to comment.
I mean, yeah, I think there's a lot of resources out there. I threw a bunch of links in, and I threw the member resource guide and campaign toolkit in there before. I think, you know, the good thing is that we're not starting from zero, that the last 10 years have really seen a lot of research come out and a lot of partnerships and institutions. There's definitely more to be done, but I also think we shouldn't disclude holistic counterspeech. So most of what we would consider counterspeech happens without any government support, without any company facilitation. Again, if we look at Bring Back Our Girls or the Me Too movement or Black Lives Matter, that all started very much from a holistic groundswell that had trickle up effects. And some of that's to do with language as well. Like if we look at just basically, I worked with some of the women that did Bring Back Our Girls out of Nigeria, and they were very conscious of language, to put it in English. They were very conscious of, it's not bring back these girls from a country you've never been to, in a town you've never heard of. It was ours. So the language of making you part of the solution. So language that was not polarizing, but was communal. And just also making sure it had female faces and it was approachable. So language matters. I think Black Lives Matter was really interesting in how their activists were clued up on making sure to proactively dissuade violence from some of the protests, actually hand out numbers for support hotlines when you went to the event, but also had the online offline nexus. So I think you're seeing, we shouldn't say that everything has to be technically optimized. Definitely some of the biggest movements have not been, but when they do get online support, they can just be hyper targeted and boosted in the right direction. So a lot of this is holistic. Most of what's online is holistically done, but I also think what we don't want to do is push people to be in spaces they don't feel comfortable in. So people should not just, with no experience, go into a neo-Nazi network and say, hey, I want to change your mind, or hey, I think you're wrong. So it's also about a bit of a do no harm principle to yourself and others, of making sure that you have the prowess or qualifications of knowing how to engage in those spaces. Obviously, a lot of partnerships with former extremists are very helpful in that. And there, you know, those types of groups that do disengagement, helping people leave violent extremist movements, that's a different type of practitioner base to the average activist. That can actually be a dangerous space to put yourself in if you're just off the fly thinking that you're dedicated to a cause. So I think we just should caution a little bit about that as well.
We just had another question for Erin on how to make counterspeech effective. You mentioned the importance of the visual. Would this include using art to counter hateful narratives? For example, on the Counterspeech Fellowship Instagram page. And why might this be particularly effective? Yeah, that's an excellent question, because I also would have added another question regarding counterspeech being a little bit more multimodal, I suppose.
Yeah, I think visuals, just, you should use yourself as a case study. We don't often do it, but think of how you scroll. Like, go onto your news feed, whether it's Instagram or Facebook or TikTok, and take 10 seconds to just look at what you stop on and question why. And I think if you did that for even 30 minutes, it would really teach you a lot about what catches our eye and why, and how long you stay on something. Like, if a video doesn't really quickly tell you what it's there to do, if it doesn't move very quickly, you keep scrolling. And so that's very hard for NGOs that have very, educated and depth to their messaging. You should see the online space as a way to redirect people to the longer message. An example would be, there was a very short stint that we worked with a German NGO, and they put together a series of memes that was kind of called "No Reason to Be Racist." And so they just did a bunch of it. It was just a short experiment, and they would put weird little German memes together. It'd be like a dropped ice cream cone, and it'd be like, shit, I dropped my ice cream. No reason to be racist. And they were kind of funny, but then when you looked at how they posted, the point was to target micro grievances, like little grievances in your day-to-day that were starting to be blamed on immigrants or starting to be blamed on minorities. And so they'd use kind of this weird humor to get your attention. But then in the post, it would lead you to websites that actually talked about data and statistics about how immigration was helping Germany or this and that. So they used the online space to stop you and make you go, huh, that's weird. And then they'd use the text to lead you to a site with more information. And so it's also seeing where in the online space are you placed to trigger awareness. So you might not have to create something new. Maybe your goal is to redirect people to existing data or articles, but you can use the online space to kind of stop them and create a little aha moment, or create that initial opening to get them to a place that they normally wouldn't go. But yeah, making things phone adaptable, putting subtitles on videos, making sure your message is very clear within the first 5 seconds, because people usually don't wait till the end of a video. And again, it doesn't have to be, you have so much technology on your phone. Apparently there's more technology on your phone today than the first spacecraft that landed on the moon. So we're in a good position to make things cheaply, easily, and quickly. And also you can test. So if you look at your metrics, within a day, you'll know where people are dropping out of your video, or you'll know what traction it is or isn't getting. And in those metrics, if you even put like $5 of ad spend on something, it will tell you how much the ad spend got you in reach versus how much you holistically got in reach. And the ideal to know if your campaign is doing well is that the initial funding behind it, even if it's just a few euros or pounds or wherever you are, it should break you out of your echo chamber. And then the content should have a natural holistic cycle of trending. If it's only the money that gets you out of your echo chamber and you have no holistic trend after that, it means your content doesn't have traction. If only the money is getting you outside of your echo chamber, it's bad. So you want to see an initial boost, and then you want to see those lines diverge, and that means your content's good. We could talk about this for hours, but that's just some real basics. But some of these links teach you about how to use those ad metrics as well.
Great, thank you very much. I don't see any more questions at the moment, and this is also like, I guess, perfect timing. Yeah, I want to thank Amalia and Erin again, and Sina, she had to leave already, but yeah, thank you all so much for being here today and for contributing and all those really interesting, I'm just seeing, sorry, I'm just distracted by the Chat. Kein Grund, rassistisch zu werden.
I don't know how to speak. I only know it if I don't have the slide. It's kein Grund, rassistisch zu werden, but I don't spell German. So it's like no reason. And it was done, again, not all counterspeech is evergreen. So it was done for a brief moment. It had its moment. Again, like, je suis Charlie does not mean much today like it did in the moment. So sometimes counterspeech has its moment, and then it's okay that it's not evergreen as long as it has its effect. Stefanie, thank you. You speak German. Thanks for jumping in there.
Yeah, I hope this is correct, if it is the title of the campaign. But yeah, thank you so much. I think this was an excellent and really interesting first session. And I'm sure the other 3 sessions are going to be super interesting and insightful as well. We're going to have a bigger lunch break now, but we will remain in the same Zoom space, so to speak. So you don't have to leave the room if you want to continue attending the other sessions. We would just ask you to just mute yourself and turn your camera off, of course. We're going to pause the recording, but you can just stay in the room. And thank you again, everyone, for attending. Thank you again, Amalia and Erin, for your presentations. And see you all later.